Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today virtually. Welcome to the session, Black Lives Matter, Reception in Eastern Europe, Russia, and Central Asia. This is the part of the series and the final part of the series, Race in Focus, from critical pedagogies to research practice and public engagement in Slavic, East European, and Eurasian studies. And the series has been sponsored by an amazing list of educational and scholarly organizations, including my graduate soul mother, Indiana University. I also want to say special thanks to Zsuzsana Magdo, who has been our point person for organizing this session, and I imagine all of the sessions. So the impact of Black Lives Matter in Eastern Europe and Russia and Central Asia has been shaped by the dominance of United States news in the world today, but also by the legacy of justified critique and, on the other hand, self-interested propaganda about the position of Black Americans from the socialist period, and especially from the Soviet Union. Pointing out the oppression of African Americans worked so well that people in disadvantaged positions in post-Soviet Eastern Europe and Russia and Central Asia were primed to compare their situation with that of Black Americans and to argue, and I quote, "We are the Black people of," fill in the blank. So the region we study has received and responded to news about Black Lives Matter in ways that are both distinct and indicative. We have four very exciting presenters today. We've encouraged all of them to speak for about 10 minutes, which is very hard because they have a lot of information and insight to share, and to leave a lot of time for questions. It is an honor for me to introduce these presenters whose lists of accomplishments would require much more time than we have today. I had to flex all of my editorial muscles to cut down what I'm going to say, but I hope you will follow through and read and follow their work elsewhere. So our first speaker today is Jacoby Williams, who is the Ruth N. Halls Associate Professor of African American and African Diaspora Studies at IU Bloomington. His research interests are centered on questions of resistance and social justice. His most recent book is From the Bullet to the Ballot, the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party and Racial Coalition Politics in Chicago. Dr. Williams is completing two books right now, Neighborhoods First, and then Global Call of Power to the People, both of them examining the impact of the Black Panther Party on non-African American groups domestically and abroad as a model for grassroots community organizing. Dr. Jacoby, take it over.
Good afternoon, everyone. Since I have the privilege of going first, I'm going to do my best to not bore you to death, and forgive me if I speak too fast. I may be trying to squeeze too much in 10 minutes, in a 10-minute span. What I want to do is first provide a brief outline of where I think my comments are going, and then try to at least paint a picture of where I hope to end. I want to make the connection between how my research into earlier connections between Black protests and political action in the United States and movements in other countries indicates a basis and background for the reception of Black Lives Matter as a movement in 2020, now 2021. Not just that people brought off, they knew a lot about the history, but that their own movements prepared them in some ways to do that. So before I do that, I want to make sure I talk about the relationship between African Americans and at least the Communist Party or Soviet support in the earlier part of the 20th century, and move forward to some of my research that deals with the Panthers and their international commitments abroad. So the long history, there's a very long history of African Americans support from and participation in the Communist Party in the United States prior to World War II, prior to the Cold War, is pretty much what I'm trying to articulate. We have a large contingent of African American communists, some of which who would travel back and forth between the United States and the Soviet Union. But then after World War II, as a result of the Cold War, we have a discrepancy that takes place between African Americans and the Communist Party and their affiliation and affinity for the Soviets. And for example, so anyone who advocated for human rights or civil rights, particularly African Americans, were easily red baited. Especially beginning in the 1950s, during the McCarthy era. And so what African Americans took offense is that The common mainstream analysis from the white power structure was that the African Americans weren't politically savvy enough to wage these kind of campaigns. It must be a Soviet threat. The Soviets must be behind a lot of this treatment. And so folks like Martin Luther King and others were accused of being communist sympathizers or influenced by the Soviets for some particular reason. And so understanding the way in which the Cold War operated, Martin Luther King himself and others used the Cold War as a way to raise civil rights struggles. For example, America is at this period identifying itself as the beacon of democracy and equality for all, as in opposition to what they claim the Soviets offer. And what Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement was able to do is highlight those contradictions. There's all these movements in the streets. There's violent episodes and the way in which violence is used to try to control the African American population, and particularly protest movements and all this discord that's taking place, which highlights this contradiction. And so understanding how those images of dogs being sicked on kids and water hoses fired on activists and protesters and women, and how those images are spread throughout the world, it tears at the fabric of American so-called beacon of equality and for all. So for what the civil rights movement is actually doing is very much a Cold War civil rights movement of using the influence of others around the world to put pressure on the United States to do something about their particular situation. I'm trying to check my time here. So what happens next is you have the groups like the Black Panther Party who evolves out of that, who are not afraid of being race baited, whereas King and others ostracized or put in the margins people who were communist sympathizers like Bayard Rustin and others are pushed more to the margins when they are central organizers of the of the civil rights movement, because they don't want to be red baited, to have the movement red baited. Well, by 1966, folks like the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense was established, and they take a socialist position, and they are not painted by those same red-baited scares. So they see themselves as part of the Third World Revolutionary International Proletariat struggle. And much of those revolutionary struggles were supported by the Soviets. And this is shortly after the Cuban Missile Crisis, which takes place between Cuba and the United States, one of those countries who fought for their sovereign independence and had the backing of the Soviets, and not just as a socialist economic position, but even went forward enough to become a communist state. And they began the relationship between the Panthers and other activists in Cuba as an asylum for others, as part of this larger discourse. So what the Panthers were advocating is they were the vanguard of revolution, and they began, because of the way in which they were taking on the hypocrisies of democratic political system and this capitalism, that they view themselves as socialists taking on this capitalist state. Groups around the world began to emulate them domestically and abroad, here and abroad. So to give you a quick brief outline of my work that I'm working on now, I've been to over 36 countries, and prior to COVID, I was been to about 36 countries, and I'm interested in the ways in which all these various groups around the world are emulating the party and organizing in terms of protests as a way of solving their economic disparities in some of those places. So I spent one summer in China prior to COVID-19. I was supposed to spend last summer in Russia, in St. Petersburg and in Moscow, but COVID prevented those trips. And I was hoping to explore the African-American experience there on the ground in Russia. And unlike my other locations where there are other Afro-Americans there was these other locations, I guess I should list them. I'm talking to you like you know who they are. New Zealand, India, Israel, Palestine, Australia, European places like London, France, even Italy emulated this Black Panther Party organization some particular way. But many of these countries, especially those in the South Asian and South Pacific, did not have any connection to the party or African Americans in general. So I'm interested in why folks are emulating African Americans' experience in that regard, or the Israelis or the Palestinians for that matter. And so my work sends me to these locations, hoping that I can find those kinds of connections in Russia, because I do know that African Americans actually do and often visited the Soviets during that period. And so again, I just talk about the ways in which my other countries have emulated the Black Panther Party, much like what's taking place today with Black Lives Matter, that the activism and protests and organizing in the streets is being emulated around the country, around the world in all these various locations. So today we have an anti-racist struggle taking place globally, but you have an interchange of ideas, of tactics, strategies, ideology, and so forth taking place due to social media, due to FaceTime, due to Zoom. Like, for example, Palestine is a perfect example in which as activists, Black Lives Matter organizing in Ferguson, and they're facing mobs and mobs of tear gas, as Palestinians who are tweeting to them, telling these activists how to prevent the burning of the eyes and stinging of eyes, to deal with tear gas of that nature. And then you begin to see the ways in which Black Lives Matter and these kinds of protests emulate and take forth in those locations well. So the way my research into early connections between Black protests and political action in the US and movements in other countries form indicates a basis and background for the reception of Black Lives Matter today is what I'm trying to argue here. Not just people around the world or abroad often knew a lot about the history of African Americans, but that their own movements prepared them to respond in certain ways by emulating the ways in which African Americans responded in protests. So I think I end there because I could say a whole lot more, but maybe there's some time for question and answer to deal with and treat these aspects in more detailed and robust ways.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. That was amazing time control. And indeed, you have a lot more to say than that. We're going to hold questions until the end of the session, so everyone is welcome to type into the Q&A. We will see those and we will line them up and ask our panelists. Thank you very much. Our second speaker is Maxim Matusevich, who is professor of history and director of the Russian and East European Studies program at Seton Hall University. Besides contributing to the Wayland Rudd collection, which I see is coming out very soon, he's the author of No Easy Row for a Russian Hoe, Ideology and Pragmatism in Nigerian-Soviet Relations, 1960 to 1991, and editor of Africa in Russia, Russia in Africa, 3 Centuries of Encounters. He's now writing a new book on the history of African-American sojourns in the Soviet Union. Dr. Matusevich.
Sibel, thank you so much. And Jacoby, I'll try to follow in your footsteps and watch my time. When I was asked, and thank you to the University of Pittsburgh for hosting us virtually, of course, a wonderful organization. When I was asked to provide those bullet points about what actually I'm going to say, I sat down and ended up writing a paper, which I had to parse down eventually, and it's still too long to read. So I think what I'll do in the next 9.5 minutes, I'll try to explain what actually resonates with me personally when it comes to this topic and how I came to the story of the African-Russian contacts and the contacts between African-American intellectuals and radicals and the Soviet dream and the Soviet idea. When I started working my first book on Nigeria, and actually I lived and worked in Nigeria, was writing that book there, I often heard, especially from the Russians, what are you writing about? There is no story there. And so many years later, it's amazing to see that actually the story actually was there, it is there, and there is a lot of interest and it's growing. My interest in this topic is twofold. On the one hand, it's my research and something I've been very much concerned with as a scholar over a long period of time. But also, as many of us in the last few years, I have become increasingly concerned about certain developments in this country, in the United States of America. And without going too political on all of you, many people probably share the distress which many of us experienced with the rise of the Trump phenomenon. And what also, I can't say it puzzled me, but definitely caught my attention, made me very uncomfortable, the realization that Trump and what he represented here in this country and beyond found a resonance within the Russian-speaking community. And again, I don't have the hard data, but I think many of us experienced this uncomfortable realization that many of the Russian speakers in the United States, in Germany, in Israel, and beyond found themselves drawn to those ideas. So I what I'll try to do in the next 5 minutes, 6 minutes, I'll try to contextualize it historically, because besides being distressed, we also need to understand the phenomenon when we face it. So to do that, I'll take zoom out a little bit, a couple of steps back, and look at the history of the Russian encounters with Africa, with the idea of blackness in all its complexity, as it was um, uh, processed in the Russian society. And I'll focus particularly on the Russian educated classes, the intelligentsia, which again is a very broad concept, but we don't have time to get really granular here. I'll start out by saying that historically, Russian identity uh, is not particularly well determined, right? For a very long time, Russians were not even sure. They still are not sure whether or not they're European or not. And this ambivalence, I think, really underlies the history of encounters going back to the 19th century. At the same time, and that's probably one of the reasons why, for example, prominent members of more liberal wing of Russian intelligence were so ambivalent, but also hostile, actually, to the idea of European colonialism in Africa. But even the conservative elements of the Russian society were apprehensive. A lot of this, I think, had to do with, again, the rejection of the European model of imperial expansion, even though Russians were expanding themselves into Central Asia and beyond, as we all know. But at the same time, there was this religious connection to Ethiopia. Both nations are Orthodox, so there is a lot going on there. But there was this underlying ambivalence. So when the Bolsheviks come to power in 1917, and there is this ostensibly clean break between the previous Tsarist regime and the new Soviet Union, I would argue there is actually some continuity. And it's interesting that the first person that I'm aware of who noticed that was Claude McKay, the great African American Harlem Renaissance poet, who probably one of the first African Americans who sort of opened up Russia for the African American intelligentsia. He comes to Petrograd and Moscow in 1922-23 on a Comintern mission, and leaves behind fascinating memoirs of the trip, travelogue. And he makes an observation that even his experience was euphoric. Later on, he would move on in a more conservative direction, but for a time, he really experienced something of euphoria, of being accepted, of not experiencing anything remotely racist, for the first time in his life. But he also notes that that experience was not limited to the new proletarian elites. He said that when he encountered the bывшие, the former people, the former members of the intelligentsia class whom he met in Moscow, they exhibited the same sort of colorblind sensibilities that he ascribed to this new proletarian elite. And that's very interesting. He's not saying this is just the Bolsheviks. He's saying Russians are different. And of course, we can take this with a grain of salt, but that's the sentiment. And the same sentiment we find in the travelogues, in the reflections of their Russian Soviet experience by other Black travelers, by Claude McKay, of course, but also Langston Hughes, Paul Robeson famously, and so on. I would argue that the sort of internationalist utopia that they experienced and absorbed and celebrated in the 1920s, 1930s would really come to an end by the mid-1930s. By the mid-1930s, the Soviet Union begins to act more like a nation state. And this process is accelerated during the Second World War, when we really have the rise of Russian nationalism. And it exhibits itself, it was very instrumental towards victory in the war, but we'll also see the expulsion of ethnic minorities, the people from the Baltics, Volga Germans, Crimean Tatars, the English, the Chechens, and you can go down the list. Many of them end up in Kazakhstan, as Diana, I'm sure, knows. And after the war, there is something else, and that's the new anti-Semitic campaign, which probably has something to do, well, we know it has a lot to do with the creation of the State of Israel, but also Stalin's general distaste for what he calls bourgeois nationalism. So he sees the Zionist movement as an example of bourgeois nationalism. This, by the way, the same stigma is applied to African nationalists. We know, now we forget about it, that Nkrumah and Leopold Senghor, they were really despised by the Soviet establishment under, the late 1940s, early 1950s. They were considered to be colonial stooges, the stooges of European colonialism. So this anti-Semitic campaign, I think, to some extent, is an extension of this distaste for third world nationalism, which, of course, this whole thing changes under Khrushchev, when there is this outreach effort to Africa, and African students begin to arrive, and it's a completely different story. These are very different people. They come from the places which had experienced or are experiencing at the time this anti-colonial fervor. The liberation sentiment is running strong, and many of them are not particularly communist, to say the least. They come for very particular practical reasons. And it's very interesting to see how these people function within the Soviet society. It's the first time when the society really encounters these sort of exotic foreigners. And 2 minutes left, excellent. So on the one hand, they're seen as a symbol of Soviet largesse and paternalism. But at the same time, they are seen as foreign. And for the Soviets, being foreign is really an exotic, attractive commodity. They're also very cosmopolitan, and they're also, by Soviet standards, quite often very privileged. Their stipends, their educational scholarships are significantly higher than what the Russians get, what the Soviets get. They have more mobility. They travel. They speak foreign languages, and they, I think, in some ways, become the conduits of new aesthetics and new political sensibilities. So it's kind of a propaganda weapon that kind of jams and backfires sometimes. And I think that's an important moment to keep in mind, because when in the next decade, after the 60s, in the 70s, you have Angela Davis celebrated and feted in the Soviet Union. Sometimes we forget how the Soviet society saw those symbols. The intention was propagandist, of course, but they also represented the world outside the borders of the Soviet Union. So there is a lot of complexity there. And all those things, I'm running out of time, so when we have Q&A, I'll be happy to elaborate on the points I'm making. But I think it's all those experiences of Soviet internationalism, which some of them accepted, others rejected by Soviet intelligentsia. When those members of that intelligentsia, many of them Jewish, by the way, we'll come back to this point because it's important, I think, find themselves in diaspora in the United States or elsewhere, the way they respond to those movements for social justice and racial justice is really peculiar. And it really is worth of sort of scrutiny. Thank you very much. I learned my lesson from Jacoby. I'm stopping here.
Jacoby, you've set such a good example. Thank you. Thank you very much, Maxim. Super interesting. And I see we're starting to gather some questions, so that's good to see. Our third presenter, I'm delighted to present, is Diana Kudaibergenova, who is a Compass Research Associate at the University of Cambridge. She studies intersections of power relations through realms of political sociology, dealing with the concepts of state, nationalizing regimes, and ideologies. Her first book is Rewriting the Nation in Modern Kazakh Literature, and her forthcoming second book focuses on the rise of nationalizing regimes in post-Soviet space after 1991. She's now completing her third book manuscript on power, state, and resistance in the contemporary art of post-Soviet Eurasia.
Thank you. Thank you. My biography is slightly outdated. I'm a lecturer now in political sociology here in Cambridge, and that's okay. My second book came out in summer, but it's fine. It's fine. It's okay. Thank you so much for inviting me and for allowing me to speak to this very important and interesting question. And I'm actually going to bring out some of my ongoing data that I'm going to basically place in my next book, hopefully, when it's going to be finished at some point, hopefully in the future. And there I'm dealing with the grassroots movements and perceptions of, as you said, the contemporary art groups. And these are highly decentralized, non-state sort of movements that are developing in different places in Central Asia, and they're all dealing with the aspects of art. So and culture. So I think it's quite fascinating that contemporary art as a new form after the collapse of Soviet Union and socialist realism and state censorship has allowed for these new forms of self-expression and new searches for identity, justice, and all these questions that are elaborated in this new society. So I find it quite an exciting field to explore, actually, for sociologists. And quite interestingly, also the response to BLM is quite evident in these movements as well, and it came out in some of my recent interviews, and I thought it was quite interesting to actually speak about that. But let me first place Central Asia in the context of where it is and how it is connected to the global world. It's often overlooked as this always connected to Russia in many ways. But actually, Central Asia tries to exist on its own as a region. It tries to present itself as well. And these connections of the artists I'm studying are actually presenting themselves as a collective coming from the region itself. So it's quite interesting. And as a region, as separate countries, they're quite well connected to the world. So we're seeing very interesting global dialogue going on through the use of internet and social media. I've written about it before, that social media is actually quite popular in many different classes, urban, rural. As long as people have access to mobile internet, it's actually quite a good platform for them to communicate, to search information, and to express their own views. And for example, just to throw some data, Instagram is one of the most popular social media platforms in Kazakhstan, for example. And also that's where the response to BLM and sort of solidarity has exposed itself in the summer of last year. As you remember, there were sort of flash mobs and things to sort of represent the Black square, and on your Instagram account is for your support for the Black Lives Matter movement. And actually, I could see from the feed of my respondents and people who I'm working with, I could see quite a lot of these Black squares being present. And they also wrote texts of solidarity, and they're actually quite active in terms of bringing out these hashtags and ideas on social media. And I found it very, very interesting to look into that support. But actually what came out quite interestingly in some of our interviews is that these artists, mainly from Kazakhstan, by the way, they were actually themselves bringing up the BLM and talking about how it should become an inspiration for their movement, because these artistic movements, they're also now transforming into social movements in many ways. And a lot of artists are at the foreground of different initiatives that are dealing with environmental protection, that are dealing with certain urban problems, also connected to the environmental issues, for example, the air pollution and so on. And they're dealing largely with the aspects of gender inequality and in general, all sorts of inequality, including the ethnic and slightly racial one. It's still a question of how race is perceived in Central Asia. And there are certain discussions going on in connection to the migrant work in Russia. And I'm looking into that literature as well when I'm writing the manuscript. But nevertheless, in these discussions, race, I would say, is downplayed more or less in Central Asia. And it's more about the idea of ethnicity, hierarchies of ethnicity, nationalism and narrow nationalism. That's what I would love to conclude with. And then the ideas of the injustices, social injustices in general, but also gender injustices. And 8th of March is coming up, and there will be a big march in Almaty, for example, and hopefully in Bishkek. So, and then when my respondents started talking about the BLM, and they said we should take an inspiration from this movement as a way to first call on the fact of these, and I'll quote directly, rigid, racist, nationalist, colonial constructs that are, end of quote, that are impeding the development and sort of the discriminating the subjects who should not be discriminated. Then another paradigm that exists there is also that they're using the response to BLM and how people respond within their communities and beyond as an analysis, and they call it the litmus test towards how people connect to their privileges and connect to their old views. These views are now called old, but also in general how they and that's again one of my respondents recently told me. She said, actually, the way I look at the BLM perception among certain people is that if they condemn it, I can see that they basically are supporting the status quo where they have privileges because they consider themselves more civilized, more, educated and so on, and that the issues of race are not connected to them. I don't want to bring out whiteness here, but basically perhaps this is also what she was talking about, is that in the Soviet and late Soviet perspective of intelligentsia, and that's what Maxim was talking about, because artists are also intelligentsia. A lot of these older generations, they do still consider themselves as being above these particular inequalities and injustices. So for my respondents in the contemporary art movement, especially the young ones, who are sort of the generation of those people who were born at the end of the 90s and 2000s, they're quite engaged in this process, and they're really critical of the fact that BLM can be condemned or perceived in a negative light, and they actually say that it's the response to the privileged position, and I think it's quite interesting as well. But I do want to come back to the fact that there is a lack of race in this discussion internally. Of course, they perceive race looking at these global movements, looking at BLM that is outside their own context, but race is still something to be further researched, and as I say, in connection to their position in Russia as migrants. And I do have some literature that talks about Central Asians and Caucasian migrants being colloquially or racially discriminated as Black, Chorny, but this is something that there is a quite disconnect between how race is perceived in BLM and how race is perceived locally. And then, as I say, and I want to conclude with the idea of narrow nationalism, is that there are quite a lot of discussions in general when you're talking about power, and that's what I'm quite interested in. Power for me is about the ability to define meaning and dominant meaning within special social or political context. And identity is definitely the biggest concept in post-Soviet space that defines these power relations. And we're talking about identity, it's particularly about nationalism. And whoever has control over definition of nationalist meaning, then that person basically has the most power. This is basically, like, in a nutshell, what I'm writing in my second book. That's why the rise of nationalizing regimes is so strong, because elites are using it, political elites are using it to legitimize their own power relations within the state. And then that same paradigm, that same framework of power relationship obviously moves down to the society, down to the grassroots movements, down to the neighborhoods and places like that. And it's sort of identity and ethnicity becomes the contextualized aspect that also defines your power relations, and how you identify yourself is your call for both injustices, but also searching for self-power. And in that sense, so far, ethnicity plays a bigger role rather than race, as I said, but also nationalism is something that these people do not really let go of easily. So despite of the fact that there is a very positive acceptance in these artistic communities about BLM, and there is even beyond artistic communities, but in general in grassroots social movements that are emerging right now, there is this interest toward BLM, Me Too, and other movements like that. But then again, they do not go still further to criticize that particular understanding of narrow definition of national. That's what I'm particularly interested and puzzled about. And just a quick thing, I know I'm probably beyond time now, but I do want to mention that there is the idea also, and I'm really excited that there's this borrowings from different concepts that are coming from race and ethnicity aspect in the West, but people do talk about whiteness, and there is an artistic group, for example, that takes on Creole and Creolization, and they do engage with that literature. And I also should talking about Creolization and how they try to form this idea of going away from narrow nationalism that was created and established during the most of the 20th century, and was established quite as a solid paradigm that then was inherited by the post-Soviet nationalizing regimes, as I call them. I think it's a very interesting way to look at this Creolization, and then how they move toward that idea that we should go beyond ethnicity and we should go beyond race. But I'll leave that to Q&A. And that movement is led by Rus Genderbekova, for example, and her last name is Genderbekova, but translated into Kazakh, so gender. I think it's quite exciting. And Maria Vilkovitsky, who are the group that is called Creole Centrum in Central Asia. And just briefly, I do have to mention that there is a decolonial movement as well in Central Asia. It's more developed in Kazakhstan, again, in the artistic community. That's why I think it's so important to pay attention to contemporary art space, because it's such an avant-garde movement in terms of bringing out all these new ideas and questioning inequality, discrimination, and injustice through these new lenses to them, and accepting this language, and then locating it within the very Central Asian context. And that's what they always want to say, is that it might come from somewhere else, but it's very, very deeply located in Central Asia. And within this decolonial movement, there are, of course, these discussions about not only colonial past, but also about the ideas of enduring inequalities that need to be addressed. And they all also take quite a lot of inspiration from BLM in the way to approach these different things. So I should stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's hard to stop. Thank you very much. And our fourth and final presenter is Angela Koci, who is Assistant Professor of Romani Studies and Chair of Romani Studies, the Romani Studies Program, and Academic Director of the Roma Graduate Preparation Program at Central European University in Budapest. Her research focuses on the intersections between gender, ethnicity, and class, as well as the social and legal inequalities faced by the Roma in various European countries. She has published several peer-reviewed academic articles and book chapters, and she's a co-editor of the Romani Women's Movement, Struggles and Debates in Central and Eastern Europe, and The Roma and Their Struggle for Identity in Contemporary Europe. Angela.
Thank you so much for the generous introduction, and thank you so much for the organizer to invite me. And actually, I would like to touch upon two really important issues that how Black Lives Matter, particularly the brutal murder of George Floyd, raised and proposed some discussions in Europe, particularly in Central Eastern European context. And after that, I would like to make some kind of epistemic link between Black scholars and Romani scholars, and how Romani scholars has been inspired by the academic discourse, which was developed by Black scholars. So I'm going to read just to be more eloquent and quick. So civil rights lawyer and legal scholar Michelle Alexander, after the brutal murder of George Floyd, forced the US to embark upon a national reckoning. America, this is your chance. Cornel West put it in these critical days since the murder of George Floyd, we may be witnessing America as a failed social experiment. So, tens of thousands of people in European cities, even in Central Eastern European cities, including Roma, took the streets in solidarity with anti-racist protests across the US. So basically, Black Lives Matter has brought an audacious momentum to recognize and articulate the structural systemic racism and reckoning with anti-Black racism. A similar reckoning with systemic anti-Roma racism is still denied and long overdue in Europe. And Europe, particularly Central Eastern Europe, should face courageously its racial history and racial present, and public intellectuals and politicians continue to deny and or underplay the depth of anti-Roma racism embedded within their societies. And Europe's governing white elites have the cognitive illusion that racism is better managed here than in the US, and certainly we have nothing to do with systemic racism and structural racism. And I just brought an illustration which is used by several other scholars and activists in Central Eastern Europe, and EU Commissioner Margaritis Schinas in June 10, 2020, prompted an open letter protest from NR, the European Network Against Racism, and 150 other organizations, appalled at his blatant denial of the existence of police violence, racist policing, and structural discrimination against people of color across Europe. So I'm quoting the Commission Vice President Schinas, who is responsible for promoting our European way of life, and that's the program, and claim that we do not have issues now in Europe that blatantly pertain to police brutality or issue of race, transcending into our system. And he continued, Europe as a whole has been doing better than the United States in issues of race, also because we have better systems for social inclusion, protection, universal healthcare. And also he emphasized that because the European tradition for protecting minorities, we have less issues than they have in the States. So that would be a really, really great message, right? If this would be the case, then we would live in another Europe, and it would be a great relief for many Romani people to not be target for racist attacks, or simply have a prosperous, meaningful future where structural racism would be dismantled and social mobilization would be an attainable reality. So as Bernard Rohrke, who is a staff member of the European Roma Rights Center, one of the international human rights organizations, which is working for the rights of Roma, and he was saying that Commissioner Sina's myopic intervention about that European tradition came just after a 14-year-old Romani boy sustained a fractured eye socket and 4 broken teeth in the course of being detained by French police. So the boy, Gabriel Georgievis, told the reporters, quoting him, "There were 4 of them. One of them put handcuffs on me and put his knees on my back. A woman officer held my feet while a bearded police officer kicked me in the face." So it's a very similar, brutal attack as what we were following in the case of George Floyd as well. And also European Roma Rights Center emphasizing that police brutality is shown in many cases, and they are bringing an example from Slovakia, and I'm quoting Bernard Rohrke, "Racism penetrates the very structures and institutions charged with upholding the rule of law, following notoriously violent mass police raid in Moldova, Nad Bodvo, this one of the village, Roma victims who were badly beaten and injured by police officers and testified as witnesses, themselves ended up in court charged with perjury. The prosecutor attributed alleged irregularities in their testimonies to their Roma mentality, which according to the expert, the psychological opinion was characterized by low trustworthiness, a propensity to lie, and emotional instability. So you got this message, right? So it's clearly racist or attributing to Roma this kind of characteristics. So basically the case have exhausted all the domestic remedies and went to the European Court of Human Rights, and 6 years after Slovak police officers invaded a Romani home and shot dead 3 family members, a couple who survived the shooting but were seriously wounded were awarded damages by the European Court of Human Rights. So as Bernard referred to that, despite having confessed to talking about the need for a radical solution for dealing with Roma people, the police officer was not charged with a racially motivated crime. To add insult, he was given a reduced sentence of 9 years imprisonment on the grounds of diminished responsibility. Instead of outreach at police violence in the immediate aftermath of the triple murder came a surge of online support for the gunman, who was hailed as a hero in social media. So basically, this is the report which is coming from the European Roma Rights Center, and I'm sure that you got the message and the treatment and what kind of racism is manifested by the police force, and also some of the scholars call it like, the racism against Roma is still a kind of last acceptable form of racism. And how this kind of event is possible, and what is the responsibility of academia? So this is one of the questions what I would like to raise. And And certainly racialization, it's a very contentious term, is discredited in colorblind academia, and critical race scholars, even in the Central Eastern European countries, is not claiming race in a biological term, rather explaining the racialization as a process and condition to explore the situation of Roma. So very recently, there's a new trend which has emerged through the schools of critical race theory and feminist intersectional theory, which certainly is coming from Black scholars, which use race as an analytical category besides gender, class, and others. So in academia, the racialization of Roma has either been neglected or not theorized at the same level of detail as for other racialized groups, including Black, Jews, Muslims, and others. Perhaps the negligence of Roma in mainstream race, racialization-related scholarship is merely a reflection of the tacitly enacted racial and epistemic hierarchy. So, however, Roma have nonetheless been racialized and perceived and treated as a different other or inferior under the rubric of culture and ethnicity, as Diana was talking about as well, right? Ethnicity as a term is much more accepted than race. As Thomas Acton convincingly argues, scientific racism was a long-standing norm of international science, and despite its loss of legitimacy in academia, quoting him, it continued to influence both popular culture and academic discourse about Roma, Gypsies, and travelers. Quote is closed. So in the wake of World War II, when the Holocaust became the primary reference point of race in Europe, race became erased and denied. However, its meaning and consequences never really evaporated. Rather, the concept of race solidified in social relations, practices, and structures. So Roma-related scholarship has found countless ways to talk about racialization without drawing on the category of race or the process of racialization. Terms include Romani lifestyle, otherized minority, ethnicized poverty, minoritized population, and so on. Also, just think about, the Slovak case, what I was referring, and it was coming from the European Roma Rights Center, and how the psychologists, right, describe the Roma as a liar, right? So this new theoretical work, which is really started by very few trailblazers, Romani scholars. So as a result of the influence of critical race theory, intersectional theory, and methodology, Romani feminist scholars have become the front runners in challenging racist and sexist epistemology and the notion of neutral knowledge production in Europe, particularly in Central Eastern Europe. So challenging Roma-related epistemology is a prerequisite for using race, racialization, and racial formation as analytical apparatuses to understand the enduring structural discrimination against Roma. So by using intersectional theory and methods termed and introduced by Black feminist scholars, Roma feminist scholars have begun to expose intersecting race, class, and gender-based oppressions, and also created a conceptual language and alternative explanatory framework. So Charles Mills succinctly explains that alternative epistemologies must come from subaltern's perspective. He argues, I'm quoting him, hegemonic groups characteristically have experiences that foster illusory perceptions about society's functioning, whereas subordinate groups characteristically have experience that at least potentially give rise to more adequate conceptualization. So quote is closed.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop you. I know you have more to read, but we need to limit the amount of time we're speaking. And
I need 1 minute.
I think you can, I hope you will have a chance to tell us the rest in an answer to one of the questions.
Sure.
Thank you so much. That was really very interesting. And thank you again to all the panelists. I'm now excited to have everyone open up answering to the questions. We have several questions in the Q&A, which I think everyone can see. We also have a good question in the chat, which we'll get to. So the question from Kyle Shibunko for Professor Jacoby: did these movements outside of the US, as far as you can tell at this point, view the Black Panther Party as a very new type of organization, or did they view it as a point of continuity with other organizations or movements that they may have had connections with before?
So most of the places where I study, the emulation is a new phenomenon. So folks were in places like Israel and Palestine, for example, or in India with the Dalit Panther Party. They saw the activism, the programs, the ways in which self-determination was put forward before and focused on educational commitments by the Panthers as a new phenomenon and how to tackle disparities within their communities. So all of these groups adopt almost every act, every principle and account of the Black Panther Party except for one, and that's armed resistance. The fascination with the gun is very much an American phenomenon, as our Second Amendment gives us the right to bear arms in the way in which we practice that. But besides, take that out of the equation, except for maybe one place, which would be the Palestinians and the advocation amongst Australians for the right to try to acquire firearms. You take that out of the equation, what really brought the emulation of those kinds of programs to those places abroad, and all these various places, whereas European or South Asian or South or Asian or Middle Eastern or any of those places, even the Caribbean. I ignore Africa and the Caribbean on purpose because Panthers actually went to those places to help set up organizations. They all adopt the programs. They like the politics and they like the revolutionary spirit, but it's the programs and the coalitions that they form that was the most salient to most of those organizations.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. The next question, I think, for both Maxim and Jacoby, it's the anonymous attendee who posted it mentions that it's not really Black Lives Matter focused question, but that they have found it difficult to reconcile the kind of left-wing protest movement and Democratic Socialists of America alignment with a great deal of Kremlin foreign policy. At least in various social conversations, a non-interventionist approach abroad in the US seems to tacitly extend to permitting subjugation abroad, Crimean Tatars, Baltics, etc., not necessarily white supremacist subjugation, but still historic political repressions. How do we approach that if we want to support both challenges to the Kremlin and failings, I guess, challenges to failings in US government?
I can jump in quickly. Actually, this touches on a concern that I've had for a long time, and I actually have it in my bullet points, but I never got to, obviously ran out of time. Sometimes the two liberation discourses historically function at cross purposes, sadly. We see that, for example, the Soviet dissident movement obviously many members of the Soviet dissident movement rejected the internationalist message of the Soviet government because it was associated with the powers that be that subjugated them, while those same themes were embraced by people who actually suffered from a different kind of oppression in the West. And this seems to be an ongoing problem. What happens now, I think, is a little bit different because the Kremlin, and I'm not a Kremlinologist, but I think the Kremlin often cynically takes advantage of the opportunities presented by the sort of political turmoil in the West. They would support BLM movement or they would support the hard right movement. You know, it doesn't really matter. You know, no ideology is involved. I've discovered this when I worked on a recent article on Russia's involvement in Africa to see how this involvement is completely devoid of ideology. It's really very opportunistic. They will take advantage of the opportunities presented to them. So I think what happens, the weird situation now, is that we have political actors on both sides of the political divide sometimes finding common language with the Kremlin, but not because the Kremlin shares their concerns, but because the turmoil, the political turmoil happening in the West, sort of works well for for the Kremlin agenda, which is really sort of to decentralize the world, to dismantle the unipolar world led by the United States. So in that case, the anti-imperialist efforts of both the left and the right in the West, they kind of meet with the Russian agenda right now. But there is a long history to that, going back to the Soviet times.
Mm-hmm. One more question for Maxim, although I hope everyone will feel free to jump in if they have contributions, from Isabel de Sisto, who has studied foreign students in the USSR from Cuba, and notes that it does indeed seem that the Africans would backfire in some ways as a Soviet propaganda tool because they brought in foreign music, clothing, ideas, etc. But an aspect that you didn't mention is the topic of racism and racially motivated violence, which African students also experienced. And she spoke with people who argued that these incidents occurred as a result of ignorance. Others say it was because of jealousy over women or over money, which foreigners had more of. And others then that she spoke to said it was outright racism. Could you share your perspective on the topic of discrimination against Africans in the USSR?
Well, very quickly, not to monopolize the conversation, I've actually written about this, and there is a number of young scholars, Nana Oseo-Pare, for example, Konstantin Katsakiores, who've published extensively on this. The quick answer is yes, African students in the Soviet Union encountered a lot of racism. It was not the only experience they had there, but they did encounter it. And a lot of this, it's a very complicated matter. First of all, we have to look at how the Soviets saw Africa, Soviet school children, for example, or members of the same intelligentsia, the proverbial Russian intelligentsia. They absorbed the same Orientalist narratives through adventure novels, through cartoons, through movies that people did in the West. So in that regard, there was a lot of confusion. On the one hand, Africa was this place that the Soviet Union supported and uplifted, but at the same time, the attitudes quite often were very paternalistic. But at the same time, to make it even more complicated, there was a lot of jealousy. There was a lot of envy. Some of it was, because Africans got Russian girls, right? For example, or Soviet girls. But they did represent the world quite often that was unattainable for a lot of Soviets. So, travel, mobility, material goods, music. So yes, there was quite a bit of jealousy. And at the same time, they were seen as associated with the regime that did not afford the same rights to Soviet citizens. So that creates the context.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. I'm going to skip one question and come back to it. Here's one from Alexa. There's been a lot of discourse also about the appropriation of the Black Lives Matter, and this is mostly discussed in the Black community. What do you make of this discourse about appropriation? For example, the use of Black Lives Matter by Mikhail Sviatov. How does one contend with the nuances and the violence of this attempt at emulating the Black Lives Matter model? And something she's been thinking about. I don't know Mikhail Sviatov, so I open that to Jacoby, to Maxim, Angela, and Diana, if you have any thoughts.
Well, I don't know that individual either, to speak quite frankly about it, but the ways in which folks have embraced Black Lives Matter around the globe has been nuanced, porous, and quite frankly, dialectical in a number of ways. You have two parts. You have folks who are only focusing on the looting and the activism, the agency of folks in the streets in that regard. But then you also have folks who push back against Black Lives Matter. Here we call it All Lives Matter. I know there's various versions of that in the Soviet Union, or I'm sorry, in Russia and various parts of Europe as well. So you have this nuanced ways in which appropriation takes place. But what Black Lives Matter will argue is, and I don't want to speak for the entire organization or the group, because there's two different organizations. I want to be clear. There's Black Lives Matter, which is now an organization, and there's the Movement for Black Lives, which is a network of local grassroots activist organizations who have a policy. If you go to moveforblacklives.org, there's a policy there of what they're demanding. So there's two different groups that are taking place, two different mantras or two different, I guess, branches of the same tree. And so I'm not sure what people are emulating. And most folks around the world don't know that. So they equate one or conflate the two when they have two different approaches to how they are attacking the situation in terms of the anti-racism approach here in the States. So you see some activism on the streets, but in other places. But what I would argue is, where is the emulation of the policies? So the Move for Black Lives has a list of policies, legislation, and changes in terms of institutions that they are advocating for that I don't see in other locations around the globe. I just see the activism around the world, but where happens? So the activism and protest, the way in which you use protest, it is to draw attention to these critical issues. Now, what do you do next? Next is where the policy changes come, the legislation, the institutions are revamped or reorganized or reformed. And so I don't see that taking place around the globe in a number of ways, but I could be mistaken. I defer to my other colleagues to how that operates in Russia.
Mm-hmm. Angela.
Yeah, although I don't know this literature as well, but like when we are talking about appropriation, I think it's really important to think about the power position as well. What is the power dynamic behind, this kind of movement of appropriation? Because the way as I think about appropriation, that it's appropriated by someone or some groups who are much more powerful, right? On the expense of subordinate, again, that specific group where this technology knowledge is coming from. And I think, the way as I wanted to talk about it, that's certainly Black Lives Matter movement, Black scholars and Black activism, political activism, tremendously inspired Romani activism in Central Eastern Europe. And I think it's nothing wrong with that if one subordinated other group want to, use the same kind of tactics or using the same kind of conceptual language, of course, contextualizing in that specific location in Central Eastern Europe. So the point what I wanted to say that when we are talking about appropriation, is really important to think about the power dynamic behind that, who is appropriating what, and in what kind of position is that group who is appropriating that certain kind of technology, tactics, knowledge, and so on.
That is a wonderful point, and I hope we can circle back to it.
Can I add a bit?
Yeah, please.
What I usually, I've had this question before, and what I like to highlight to folks is I wouldn't even use the word appropriation. That's why I deliberately use the term emulation, because what's taking place is there is a need to address these issues. And what Black Lives Matter protests in the streets, at least, and the activism organizations here in the States or the West, is given a model, provide a model of how folks can use that to highlight these critical issues that aren't being addressed in their various locations around the globe. So I see it more as emulation than appropriation in that regard, to at least start the conversation, begin the activism towards trying to change some of the conditions in which folks live. And so it relates quite to the question about the representation of Africans in Russia, for example, right? I'm sure they're experiencing racism in all these various ways, but this gives a model to actually bring it to the fore, to emulate some of the activism and protests to force the state, i.e. the state, to deal with these issues.
Thank you, Jacoby. That was perfect. And Angela, I was really thinking, although I hadn't thought it through, it would be so interesting to know, and maybe we don't know yet, how are the people who are working with Black Lives Matter from whichever angle reacting when they see that their ideas have been picked up. And I imagine feeling a sense of great solidarity and support for Roma organizations in Europe. I will stop now because this is something that I hope again we can circle back to, but there's a question in the Q&A for Diana. What is the relationship between Central Asian governments and the independent artists who are drawing attention to social inequalities?
Yeah, that's basically, can you hear me? Yeah, that's where I'm placing myself theoretically, is that I'm looking at how independent art is actually not institutionalized at all, and they choose to do so because they don't want to be part of the artist unions that are still remaining. They don't want to be part of the so-called official art. And Janara Noruzbayeva, who's a cultural anthropologist, she wrote fantastic work about that, how an intersection between market and class makes certain artists after the Soviet Union fall into this perspective of following official art and so on. And it's actually what they do is that because they retain this independent position within the state and society, not being funded by the state in any sense, which also brings them to precarity, but it also allows them, and ask me about market later on, okay? But they don't sell as often, but it allows them to question all of these power structures and actually question the state and the government itself, and what's the nature of that state. And that's where I'm drawn, because I'm still a political sociologist, I'm not an art historian, but I'm drawn to this debate and to this discussion of where power lies. And to them, they question everything. The painting you can see behind me is basically a work by Guanush Bazargaliyev, where he questions the whole idea of avant-garde by placing Kazakh ornament or Central Asian, a traditional ornament into the black square of Malevich. And that to me is the representation of this. I'm claiming power. I'm claiming what I see, what I define as state, and I'm claiming what I see and understand as ethnicity, identity, gender, and all of the others, categories of meaning. And that's what's really interesting to me. And in a way, that's what I'm still considering of how race comes into that. But I'm definitely quite interested in why and how they picked up the BLM, and what Professor Williams completely said. I absolutely agree with that, how they emulating and seeing how they can learn from this woman. It was an absolutely great answer. I just wanted to highlight it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I'm going to skip ahead to a question from Sunny Rucker-Chang. Hi, Sunny. How nice to know you're out there. Could Angela speak about the embrace of Black Lives Matter, but the rejection or general indifference to the safety, health, and protection of Romani lives throughout Europe by way of marches, activism, etc.? Angela, do you see a contradiction in these positions, or can or should they be seen as separate movements?
Thank you, Suni. I'm glad to know that you are here as well. So, well, I mean, there were some really interesting incidents which could be related to your questions. For example, in Hungary, there was a huge protest and against anti-Black racism in the US, particularly in June. And there were actually another group of protesters who were Roma, and they were protesting for, Roma Lives Matter as well. And which was really interesting that it didn't really spark any kinds of, solidarity with the Roma. I mean, from those groups, like mainly white, middle class, liberals, very open-minded, progressive people who were protesting against anti-Black racism, but they didn't really show that much solidarity with Roma. So it's again, the issue, what I try to refer to, this kind of still, I mean, racial hierarchy still exists. And also there is this cognitive denial that, we just, what's Roma life? And particularly during this COVID time, when COVID really become a magnified lens in our society. So inequality is just becomes so brutally visible, right? And tangible. And Roma basically, in many of the villages and settlements are completely abandoned and isolated. And instead of providing any kinds of health service, there is a militarization of these settlements and place where Roma are living. So certainly there is a contradictions, and these movements are not really connected, but amongst Roma, Black Lives Matter is very important and very inspirational and very liberational as well.
Thank you very much. If my panelists don't mind, I'm going to shift into the chat, and I don't think attenders can see the chat, so I'm going to read the question. Forgive me, it's a little long, but it's good. This is from Alex, and Alex says, I'm a Black student of Russian studies and have visited Russia 5 times. And what I found was that racism in Russia towards Black, Indigenous, and people of color was very superficial, if it even showed up. More often than not, racially charged conversations were triggered by ignorance rather than malice. And most conversations about race were born out of curiosity more than anything else. What I found jarring while working for a Russian restaurant in the US was how people who moved here exhibit a lot of the same ignorant behavior, while also harboring racial attitudes they developed since moving to the US, and how they overwhelmingly supported Trump, including those who loathed Putin. My main question here is, do you think that greater exposure to Black culture in the US could lead to more racially charged attitudes in Russia?
Well, can I say a couple of words? This is a little bit down my alley. I think there is a tendency among Russia's so-called liberals, because these liberals, when transplanted to Western soil, very quickly moved to the right. There is a suspicion of anything that is associated with the history of Soviet internationalism, and that applies to the question of racial equality. So there is this tendency to automatically suspect anyone or any entity that speaks up on behalf of people who are racially oppressed of being red, and it first became obvious to me and other observers of this phenomenon with the appearance of Obama, who I think we can agree is a very moderate, middle of the road politician, but was immediately labeled as a sort of left-wing radical by exactly the same kind of people. And it became quite clear that this is, they're sort of inheriting this Cold War mode where, Black equaled red, so to speak. There is that tendency. Whether or not the exposure to, also what happens when you're, a lot of these people, when many of them are Jewish, when they arrived in the United States and filled out their forms, for the first time in their lives, they mark themselves as white. They became white the moment I became white, the moment I crossed the American border. I had no idea I was, I was Jewish in the Soviet Union. All of a sudden you became white. So yeah, being here in the United States developed all these racial sensibilities that probably they didn't have before. But I have to say that there is a history of rejection of Soviet internationalism, and there is a history of growing up consuming all this Orientalist adventure novels and the same stereotypes that form the perception of people in the West.
Any other comments on that question?
So I'll just echo what Maxim outlined. He hit the nail right on the head, the way in which whiteness and white supremacy, at least in the United States context, is the foundation of a lot of the institutional legislation policies historically on the books here in the States, and how that transpires here. Now, I haven't visited Russia, so as this gentleman has been there 5 times, so I'm hesitant to comment. So I will say that much of my perceptions is speculative at this point. I have hypotheses and theories that I hope to tackle and address when they're on the ground. But I'm assuming that these issues of white supremacy or the ways in which people of African descent are discriminated against are systematic and institutionalized. So it's hard to just relegate that down to ignorance. I think we are being apologetic when we just relegate those actions to ignorance. Those actions are learned and those behaviors are learned, and usually they are learned through institutional systematic ways. And much like Angela has outlined in the connections between power and how power operates in those centers. So once one enters the American stratosphere and learns how the racial hierarchy works here, everyone does this. I don't care if they're coming from Russia or they're coming from, they're phenotypically dark-skinned West Indians. When they get here and they figure out, realize what the racial hierarchy is and where opportunity and access, because folks who are immigrating here for economic reasons, right? They want to go high up the economic pole. And when they realize this, could be West Indians, could be South Asians, could be phenotypically white, Jewish, Russians. When they get here and realize that racial hierarchy, everyone's trying to assimilate to whiteness because that's where the access and opportunity is. No one wants to be at the bottom. And so it's not hard to adopt those practices, but I argue that those behaviors were already there. They just aren't shined upon or even rewarded. I would argue when they're here in the States, even rewarded for having such sentiments. But again, I don't want to speculate about something I haven't examined in great detail. So I could just speak on the American context.
Thank you very much. I'm going to skip ahead to another question from Raushan Jandaeva. How are the views of contemporary Russian liberal opposition on the Black Lives, views on the Black Lives Matter, taking into account that a lot of them embrace the narrative of Russia as a Western nation? There seems to be little condemnation or acknowledgement of racist actions in the US or support of the movement by them. So the Russian liberal opposition, what are their views? Any of you work on the Russian liberal opposition?
Well, just a quick observation that the Russian liberal opposition, I think age matters here. The younger generation is more sort of cosmopolitan, they speak the language. They have better understanding of American history and the history of race and racism in the West. The older generation of sort of post-Soviet liberals, again, I think the knee-jerk reaction is to reject anything that smacks even remotely of Soviet internationalism. It's immediately suspect. And that's where the dividing line is, I think, at this point. Also, I have to say very quickly that the Soviets, we never learned American history. You would think that with all the sloganeering, all the, being bombarded with the, images of racial oppression in the West, we would know more about American history, but we never learned about it. You ask an average Russian immigrant in the United States about massacre in Tulsa, for example, or about the exodus of Black population from Springfield, Missouri, when I started my teaching career. They never heard about it. So there is a really fundamental lack of academic knowledge about those things. That's another reason.
Right. Here's a question for Dr. Kudaibergenova. You've mentioned the appearance of broader movements of decolonization in Central Asia and movements that might be said to have an analog globally. You've also mentioned that race doesn't often enter the conversation there of grassroots political action. I'm curious if you could speak a little more about how the concept of race among Central Asian grassroots arts groups has shifted directly due to reception of foreign media coverage of Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, it's a very important question. Actually, when I was preparing my notes, I was constantly thinking about it. And I think it's still shifting. I could see it more among my respondents who live in Russia. And that's something, it's still worth exploring, and it's still worth looking into in general, how discrimination is perceived in terms of the color, and how that color then travels. And I'll be speculative here, which I almost never do. But to me, the question in contemporary Russia is more, it's not so much vested in this understanding of race as it is vested in, for example, US, right? But it's still about color. And I think a lot of my respondents were talking about being discriminated, being racialized, and they openly said, like, I'm being racialized. People are looking at me in certain ways, and I'm treated badly in Moscow, but when I moved to St. Petersburg, it changes for some reason, and I can see the differences. But these are artists, so some of them are becoming social scientists now, and they're learning social theory, critical theory, but they still, finding ways to explain why and how this happens. I do study more ethnicity, so for me, and I could see that the whole post-Soviet space is very much dominated by understanding of nationalism and ethnicity, and the decolonial discourse as well, because decolonialism is seen as a mainstream discourse by a lot of people. Still, it's misread as fight against injustices that were brought by the colonial power, be it Russian Empire or Soviet Union. That's still questionable. How much of one or the other were more colonial, and how it's every subject or every person who speaks of that perceives it like that, but it's more, to a lot of people on the surface, it's a lot about these injustices that are going back to the understanding of either national sort of ethnic perspective. But then, yes, of course, anti-colonialism anti-colonial discourse is much deeper, and it's more about empowerment and then reconsidering and rethinking a lot of these things. But and I would say race is entering that debate, but it's quite slow. I do see, from what I see in my data, and it's still quite raw and I still need to analyze it, but I could see from the responses that they're giving is that they feel it, and they try to conceptualize it into not just inequality, but actually pure discrimination. That's why they compare it, if not to BLM, then at least to certain instances of racial discrimination elsewhere. But my sort of hypothesis on this is that Soviet Union wasn't so much focused on race. It was very deeply rooted in the understanding of ethnicity and cultural identity rather than race. So, and I'd love to hear from Professor Matusevich here, like, why and how. I think this is a legacy of Soviet Union, that it shifts in this discourses and discussions, but it's definitely somewhere there that might emerge at some point quite soon. I hope, thank you. I hope I have.
Yeah, Maxim, do you want to step in for a moment?
For a second, this is not really my field, I have to admit, but based on what I know, the Soviets were primarily concerned with this idea of дружба народов, the friendship of the peoples, which was articulated in terms of ethnic particularism, right, and local cultures, meaning, the groups who constituted the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Yeah, I think the study of, it's really interesting. The Soviets never studied race. We know that in the 1940s, actually starting in the late 1930s, the whole field of African studies was decimated. Like literally, people were imprisoned, some were shot. So those things, the study of race was looked upon with great suspicion, at least through the end of Stalin's reign. It was associated with various bourgeois nationalisms. And I think the study of ethnic particularism was the far preferred category, which goes back, if I'm not mistaken, to the way how Stalin himself formulated those ideas back in 1917. So yeah, there was very little study of race, and it was discouraged. And I think, some of the things we're discussing here today, in many ways, are the legacy of that lack of academic study of race, including at the African Institute in Moscow.
Comment in the chat. Russia did study race in the sense of overground imperialism. So there's another question for you, Maxim, so keep yourself unmuted. This is a pretty narrow question for African Americans in the USSR in the 1930s. So actually, Jacoby, you may have seen evidence of this, although more when you get to that archive after COVID. For African Americans in the USSR in the 1930s, how did the use or consumption of the Moscow News, how did they use or consume the Moscow News as the first English language newspaper in Russia or the USSR beginning in 1930?
I can't claim to know much about it. I assume they read it, but I would direct this question to Dr. Sean Guillory, who is at the University of Pittsburgh and who actually publishes in the Moscow News. So, if you reach out to Sean, he might have, the response to their question.
Thank you very much. Here is a question for Professors Jacoby and Matusevich. What's your point of view on Black Lives Matter marches becoming, quote, trendy, end of quote, among youth in East Central Europe? Thousands of selfies flooded Facebook during the marches. Not sure even half of them knew what exactly the institutional racism and US police brutality are. Thank you.
I guess I chime in first. It's a catch-22. It's catch-22, meaning it's great to have support, to see that folks are using social media as a platform to show solidarity. But again, I juxtapose those kinds of solidarity, Facebook or social media selfies with what takes place here. And so you get a lot of people liking things and sharing things, but not actually on the ground helping to implement change. And so that's the other side of the catch-22. Where's the action after that? So protest is to highlight these injustices, and it's great that you support them, but now we need you to actually show up here in the States, for example, to the polls to vote against certain legislation, to support particular candidates. So I'm not sure how that transpires over there on the other side of the world. I will challenge those students and the person asking the question, don't just like something. How do you implement the change that folks are fighting for? And so there's usually some policy or systematic or institutional changes that folks are advocating for. That's where the support is desperately needed in those campaigns and those fights. So thanks for the likes and the sharing, but we need some actually engagements and feet on the ground involved in that, in the harder grassroots works of trying to change institutions and systems and challenging power.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think this is inevitable. America is the United States of America is the trendsetter in the world. What happens here, the snowstorm in New York City matters, because people pay attention to this. People start calling me from Moscow, asking, how's the weather? Do we know what the weather like is in Moscow? It's the imperial cultural center of the world. So these things will be happening. There is no escape. This reminds me of, this huge fashion for Angela Davis hairdos. My mom sported one back in the 1970s, or the high boots that she was wearing when she came to the Soviet Union. So yeah, there will be a lot of superficiality. It's just because the movement is global and it comes from the center of global cultural imperial power, which is the United States of America. So yes, as Jacoby said, do something else, don't just like, but there will be a lot of likes.
I just have to put in a word for anybody wanting to look like Angela Davis is on the right track. That woman is always looking good, always looking good. I'm interested in the question, this isn't in the chat, but interested in the question of provincial versus metropolitan Russian attitudes. And I ask this because I was in Tomsk visiting the university before Black Lives Matter. I think it was 2017, or before the current prominence of Black Lives Matter, I should say. Of course it was. But I was told by people who were interested in having our students come to visit that students of different racial backgrounds could be in Tomsk and not be concerned about their safety because of the ethnic variety of that area, that there were so many people of non-Western European ancestry there. And so I was interested in that. They were already paying attention and sort of adding up the things they had to offer, being out in Siberia, 4-hour plane flight from Moscow, and yet, sort of holding up with pride the fact that their local culture was not going to be, although who knows, right? I mean, if we had a Korean American student going, that would be one thing. I don't know. The Black students we've had from Swarthmore who went to Russia did not go to Tomsk. They went to Moscow and St. Petersburg or Ukraine. Anyway, I'm moving on to another question. There's a comment, actually, not a question, from anonymous attendee, who's my best friend among the attenders. And anonymous attendee commented that it's also the case that anonymous attendee who knew a lot of underground musicians in Russia would use ethnic terms or racial terms that white Americans might feel funny using, but they respected Black people. So that's more of a comment, but if anyone has a response, I'm happy to. If not, I'm scooting back up to a second question from the same person. Isabel de Sisto says, another interesting topic is the Afro-Russians or Afro-Ukrainians, Afro-Kazakhs, etc., who are the children of marriages between Soviets and Africans, usually Soviet women and African men. Can any of the panelists speak to how these people engaged, if they did, with the global BLM movement? If you know.
Well, there were definitely instances of probably the best known Afro-Russian or Afro-Jewish Russian is Yelena Khanga, the famous journalist and TV personality who wrote that book Soul to Soul about her family story. She's daughter of the late Lily Khanga, Lily Khanga, who really for a long time was the most visible African Russian So yeah, I mean, there are all those connections and all these new subjectivities emerging, and people develop new consciousness of their background, which manifests itself. There is a woman in St. Petersburg who started her own blog and actually attracted both a lot of support and hatred last July, because she was speaking on behalf of those Russian who have African parentage, or have African parentage. So yeah, those things are absolutely happening, and probably not as visible, but will be, I think, eventually if we pay more attention.
Here's another question that I had sort of scooted past. Would anybody be able to comment on how Black Lives Matter was received in the South Caucasus in particular? Another possible answer could be, do you know someone who would know that? All right, keep thinking, keep thinking. Perhaps we can send out a report after this. At this point, we have, wait, no, there are more, here's a question for Angela. Have there been examples of Black activists in Europe expressly reaching out to Roma activists or organizations? Thinking about the French context, especially after you mentioned that one example of brutality there and the huge amount of publicity of Assa Traoré and her work.
Yes, actually, I'm really proud that we start to work with Cornel West and Patricia Hill Collins, like Romani feminists, scholars. They reached out them, and we start to organize together a round table at Harvard University, and we still would like to continue. For example, at CU, right in this summer, we're gonna organize a summer school on critical race theory, like new frontiers in Romani studies, insights from critical race theories, and we're gonna invite several scholars from US, and 10 o'clock, 9:30 in Budapest, and my mind is just completely blocked, and names I just completely forget, but absolutely. So it's very important, and we are, we are seeking to work together and create a solidarity inside the academia as well. So not just like in political activism, but certainly, I mean, we can think about it. What is academia? Everything what we are doing is very much political as well, right? So and we really believe that it's very important to work together and make this kind of epistemic link and connections, and yes.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Angela. I was trying to unmute myself, but I hadn't ever muted myself. Yelena Hanga's mother was Lily Golden. Thank you. Thank you. Good to know. So here's another question for Dr. Kudaibergenova. I know that scholars have looked at how immigrants from Central Asia and the Caucasus have been racialized as Black in Russia, and is curious how class may intersect with race and how people in Kazakhstan respond to these racializations.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and I have two questions in the Q&A, so I'll try to answer this quite quickly. Yes, I would suggest works of Jeff Sahadeo on late Soviet migrants from Central Asia and South Caucasus to the Soviet Union, how they were perceived. And I found the whole discussion and how he presented his book quite useful in terms of the shifts of race. And that's what I mean, is that they viewed themselves in Moscow as, equals in the 1980s. And then all of a sudden, and he describes that in the 1990s, they became the second class. And I think there's just to say there's a huge, there's a huge room for discussions about race in these perspectives of what happens in the post-Soviet moment and why and how race sort of falls out from our dictionaries, and we're focusing more on nationalism and ethnicity. I think it's quite a useful field to explore. I am myself the victim of following the Soviet legacy, and I actually am particularly interested in national codification and the ethnic aspect rather than race. And also another book that I would definitely highly suggest to read is by Rustam Jean Nurimboyev, my former colleague at Lund University. He published recently a book on Central Asian migrants, and it's an ethnography, and it's open access from the UC Press. So please look at that and sort of the aspects of legality and illegality. But his is an ethnography of Uzbek migrants and how they navigate the legality and illegality in Moscow. And I think it's quite a fascinating study. I do think that class plays a role. I looked into some literature that defines, and I don't want to, mention that ethnic slur or racial slur toward migrants in Russia, but there's quite an interesting literature emerging now in Russian language itself. And I looked into that for one of my chapters that I'm writing on the understanding of what Central Asia means and how people don't want to be Srednyi Asiat anymore. So that's the term that Russians use towards the whole region. But I do think that yes, class plays out a role, but and there is I think also something quite interesting to focus in terms of somebody mentioned liberal opposition in Russia, but the rhetoric of certain opposition people and leaders about how Central Asia or Srednja Asia, again the same term that was used during colonial period, is used separately from, for example, Kazakhstan. But then Srednja Asia or Central Asia is often meshed up together with Caucasus, and then there is blurring lines of where is what, but then within this blurring lines of geography, there's a very clear line of hierarchy. And all of a sudden, and I listened to some of the interviews of the opposition leaders and how Kazakhstan stands out as this, I wouldn't say racially or ethnically, but it was slightly above others. All this, blurred others who are more or less lower, and then all of a sudden Kazakhstan is slightly better. But it wasn't explained why, but it's definitely in the rhetoric, and I think it's something worth paying attention to. I'm not the scholar of migration. I'm just saying, highlighting it immediately. I'm a scholar of nationalism, but it's definitely out there, and I'm looking at. I'm exposed to that through other means by looking at the news and so on and so forth. But I think it's there.
There's another question for you in the Q&A. Is state policy in Kazakhstan, or is the state policy of celebrating multicultural identity and ethnic diversity effective in preventing discrimination against ethnic minorities and migrants from auls?
That's a huge question, definitely. I'm actually quite thinking a lot about urban-rural migration and how people are viewing themselves as more or less, as my colleague and co-author called it, underclass. That's definitely there. And the underclass is based not only on ethnicity, but actually the place where you're coming from. And if you are from the province or the village, aul is the village. And if you don't have certain level of urbanity, and in Kazakhstan, it's slightly different story. It's not about so much the color, but it's about language. And the urban spaces, they do have certain linguistic hierarchies that also now becoming not only Russified, but also Kazachified. And if you don't fall into these linguistic and also class-based divisions, then definitely you are discriminated. State policy on multiculturalism is quite good. It's one of the best, I think, in the post-Soviet spaces, but then definitely how far the state can go and how far can state counter these things. And I'm definitely agreeing that policy needs to be, policy needs to be changed and enhanced in that way, but it also should come from the understanding of these social groups that are, they're voicing their discontent, they're voicing their discrimination as well, but it's not yet as an organized of a voice. So we'll see that in the forthcoming years, definitely.
Super, thank you so much. Diana, you mentioned you had some questions in the chat. Do you want to just answer them in the chat? Because I don't see other questions to you. Maybe they were sent to you individually.
No, I think I already answered them.
Excellent, thank you. Now, our panelists, it's open season. You may ask one another questions.
I have several, but I relegated maybe just to one. So I'm interested in the ways in which the organizing around Black Lives Matter played out in Russia. So to see if there are any parallels to here. So for example, I talked about the ways in which in the past, groups like the Panthers or King and so forth are organizing, and then those movements are being emulated in other parts of the globe. But it's very much a male-driven leadership position-wise, but the backbone have always been women. And so now today with Black Lives Matter, most of the leaders and architects and the movement, the backbone of the movement are women. and they're out in front. So it's a quick dynamic, a clear dynamic change there. And not just women, but queer women. So I'm wondering what it looks like on the ground there in any capacity. Is it organized in any sense? Who are these leaders? Is it grassroots? Are women in the forefront like they are here now? What roles does sexuality play, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? No one knows. Okay,
Yeah.
so we're still
And
figuring those things out.
maybe not just in Russia, right? Or
Well, anywhere, yes.
yeah, comments on any part of the region, Eastern Europe, Russia, Central Asia.
Yeah, I haven't visited any of those locations yet, so I'm looking forward to invitations from everyone, so I can get there. But yes, what does it look like? Not just the lights and so forth. What does it look like?
My response would be very superficial, anecdotal, based on what I saw on social media. And again, it's very limited, obviously, but I did follow the events. Most of the voices I heard were female voices of people speaking up and in support of Black Lives Matter and articulating those ideas in the Russian context. But again, this is unscientific. It's just what I observed. I observed many, many more women speaking up than men, but that's just what I saw. I also, little anecdote, the one major Black Lives Matter demonstration that I heard about in the post-Soviet spaces took place in Tallinn, which is the capital of Estonia, and it was conducted by representatives of the Russian-speaking minority in Estonia. So emulating, appropriating, but they took on the cause of the Black Lives Matter to argue for the rights of the Russian-speaking minority in Estonia. That's how global it gets, right? But I can't really speak personally. I don't know, maybe Diana would know more. What I saw was more female voices, definitely, what I heard.
Right, we've got a comment in the chat. Jacoby, you're being very accommodating towards other communities and speakers. However, I want you to talk more about socialism in the US and how it relates to contemporary Russia and how the Black experience in the US and US foreign policy relates to Russian foreign policy. A great deal of US socialism seems fairly accepting of Russian foreign policy and adds, how do you feel about it?
How do I feel about it? One way of answering that is historically. Let's talk historically about how I feel about it. So again, the group that I study the most is the Black Panther Party. They are a socialist organization, and they see them they argue that they're part of this, what they call the Third World Revolutionary International Proletariat Struggle. And much of those Third World countries who were overthrowing colonial power were backed by the Soviets. And I briefly mentioned Cuba as one of those, but the Panthers they're reading Che Guevara, they're teaching political education classes. They're reading the Red Book by Chairman Mao. They consider themselves Marxist-Leninists, for example, in all these various ways. And that trickles down. One of the people who's training them is Angela Davis, who is a communist, to be quite frank about it, who's teaching most of their political education classes. So socialism becomes, in our context, United States context, socialism is what's adopted the most. Communism, no. Some folks had aspirations of becoming communists, but here in the States, folks are mostly anti-capitalist. They like democracy, but they argue that America can never live up to its ideals of its democracy because of capitalism and the ways in which it divides and conquers people, particularly among racial lines, but around class lines. So they have this race, class, gender, intersectionality analysis. And so they see socialism, what they argue democratic socialism, as being more equitable. Even Martin Luther King comes to this much later. This is why we argue, this is why King is killed. When King is marked for just civil rights, he's fine. But when King begins to challenge capitalism and advocates himself as a democratic socialist, King's assassinated. And most of these folks who are involved in the Black Panther Party are either assassinated or exiled or falsely imprisoned. Right, and it's supposed to be a democratic state. This is what we would argue what the Russians do, not what Americans do. But no, this is exactly what America does, especially under the protecting the rubrics of white supremacy. And so you fast forward that up to our current context, much of what, if you want to see those connections today, I always employ folks to go to moveforblacklives's.org, M4BL, Org. And we have an entire policy and platform there that mirrors much of what folks were arguing 50, 60 years ago. And most of that is built in this idea of socialism. Many of the people today who are involved in Move for Black Lives, our candidate is Bernie Sanders. We don't want Biden. We're not interested in none of these so-called freaking progressives. They're not doing anything to address the racial and class dynamics. They're just another perpetuation of the institutions and structures that we're trying to dismantle. And because of that, you can see how the election played out in terms of how Biden was winning. And the people on the ground, the grassroots folks are advocating for this socialist candidate, and the ways in which the Democratic Party, not the Republicans, circled the wagons. They did it in 2016. They did it again this time around with folks in the back burner having conversations. This would be the Obama and others having conversations with the candidates to force them all to drop out at a particular time and put all their energy behind supporting Biden. And then all of a sudden he wins, right? That was a concerted effort on behalf of these so-called progressives, and they're not progressive. And so we see folks like, if we're looking at the election, folks like Biden and maybe Elizabeth Warren being more equitable to the kind of racial and class dynamics that we're dealing with. Now, let me be clear, Bernie Sanders has some racial issues too, but at least he's open to listening. So you see activists taking the mic from him in some campaigns, but he's open to addressing those issues. But at the end of the day, economics commands politics. And for us in the ground, looking at class dynamics, socialism is that key. So I identify as a democratic socialist as well. Much of what I study, the Panthers, they look to places like Canada, for example, which always had a democratic political system, but from the very inception was socialist. We are anti-capitalist. My politics is very much in tune to that. I'm a small D Democrat, not a Democratic Party person. I'm an independent, if you want to know my positions. And I'm maybe giving you too much there. You know, the state is listening, and what the repression really looks like in America. It is real. And with that said, I will say that how that relates to foreign policy from the Soviets, we have a love-hate relationship historically, African Americans with the Soviets. For example, much of our struggle, what we call the African American liberation movement, not just civil rights or Black power, it's just too narrow. We have a long, continuous struggle that we call the African American liberation movement. The Soviets and now the Russians have always supported those campaigns in some way, shape, or form. I could think back to the 30s with the Scottsboro trial, for example, to some of the issues that are taking place today. But ironically, the Russians have been a problem as well, like the way in which they circumvented the election by targeting African Americans and Black Lives Matter with their bots and their campaigns on social media to force African Americans not to go to poll, and we get this racist ass orange man president. That was Russian interference. And we can't divorce that from that. And so are you with us or against us? So we have a love-hate relationship with the Soviets. So they support our campaigns and hinder our campaigns in a number of ways. I'm not well versed in Russian foreign policy to have a robust conversation about it. I usually defer to my grad school colleague and comrade in arms, Sean Guillory, who's more in tune with Russian politics. So when I have those questions, I usually ask him those concerns or ask for directions for where to stick my nose in some contemporary works or books or articles or newspapers to figure out what's really taking place. But in terms of socialism as an idea, as an ideology, as an economic principle, there's a lot of folks on the ground here. That is what we're pushing. You'll see that in what we don't call, but what right-wing folks call the squad. You have some progressive folks in which Black Lives Matter, which we as the movement for Black Lives, I should say, was able to run people for office and win in a number of congressional seats and local elections. So for us, it's not about foreign policy. It's about politics is local. So there's more taking place in our local communities that affect our lives more than what's taking place at the national or even in the foreign policy of Russia. So we focus mostly on local politics. So we focus on district attorneys. We focus on state legislatures. We focus on congressmen and now trying to run certain senators for office. So we focus on local aspects that we actually can change in policy, judicial decisions, legislations, and institutions, because all those filter down to practices on the ground that we are challenging. And so we focus on things we can actually change. So we don't spend a lot of time at the grassroots looking abroad at the foreign so to speak. So it's ironic to hear my colleagues say the ways in which America is influencing these other places, like it's snowstorms and folks are in tune, but maybe that's American exceptionalism and arrogance, that we ourselves, that we do a lot of self-criticism, that we aren't looking abroad enough to make those connections, unlike the past when our activists did. So whether it's King or the Panthers, whomever, they're looking at what's taking place around the world and also learning and emulating some of those struggles to apply those theories and philosophies to the struggle for African Americans here. We don't do much of that in our current context. And I don't want to speak generally because I'm sure there's some people who push back against that. But generally speaking, we don't have those kinds of connections besides what we do on social media with liking campaigns. I say we have a more robust social justice connection with certain groups, and that's mostly with folks with Palestine, to be quite frank, and some other movements, but not what's taking place in Russia.
Okay, some more questions gathering in the chat. There was a clarification. Can anti-capitalism and socialism and equitable DSA ideas be reconciled in any way with aggressive Putin poisoning dissidents or Baitka beating people? I don't know. Maybe you've already addressed that, Jacoby. I'll go on to the next one, but feel free to jump back to that one, saying to piggyback off that question, or those questions, there's also an issue with socialist US groups' denial of ethnic cleansing, genocide of groups like the Uyghurs, due to support of Chinese communist politics. This support seems at odds with heavy support of the movement for Black lives. I don't know whether any of you has a comment on that.
I'm unfamiliar with who these people are he's referring to, but most of the social justice folks in circles that I'm familiar with are advocating for human rights for all, because we see social justice and human rights issues. And so we take folks to task around those human rights concerns, whether it's China or Russia or Israel, especially Israel, which we get a lot of pushback because advocating on behalf of human rights does not make us anti-Semitic, and we get accused of that, activists, a lot. We can support Israel and then criticize them for their human rights violations at the same time, as we do here in America. Here, America is one of the egregious examples of human rights violations. And so I'm not sure who those folks are that's taking place, who you identify. So usually I ask folks to be specific, name some names, who are you talking about? I'm not sure who those people are.
Sorry, I was writing in the chat. Open back up to invite you to ask one another questions. We've got 10 minutes, let's use it well.
Well, if I can, I hate this expression, circle around, right? You know, but everyone is using it these days. So I think, again, I don't know the names, right? You know, as Jacoby just said, you know, I can't just like randomly make statements. It seems to me that, like back to my earlier point about how some Russian liberals, right, or Russian-speaking immigrants in the States, how they respond to Black Lives Matter. Again, I'll get back to the issue of a lot of these immigrants being Jewish, you know, having come from the Soviet Union. You know, the vast majority of that wave of immigration who left in the 1970s and then late 1980s, early 1990s came here, they're Jewish. And many of them do have a very sort of emotional attachment to the state of Israel, of which they may or may not know much or anything, right? You know, but it's kind of a historical fact. And I think some of the rejection of the Black Lives Matter narrative may come from those allegiances, you know, which run very deep. And for them, it's so complicated. You know, we mentioned, you know, how people become white once they cross the border, you know, how they attain white privilege, you know, at the same time they refuse to admit it. At the same time, they buy into the narrative of trauma and suffering. And when they look back, you know, they think they look at the anti-Semitism they experienced back in the Soviet Union, And they only recognize the kind of anti-Semitism that was articulated in terms of anti-Zionism. That's the anti-Semitism they experienced in the Soviet Union. I was very surprised when the Charlottesville march happened, with the neo-Nazis and white supremacists marching in Virginia and chanting, Jews will not replace it. I studied the response by the immigrant press or social media. There was none. It didn't resonate. They're chanting Jews will not replace us, and even that doesn't impress. While anything that smacks of the Soviet-style anti-Zionism really resonates and makes people very nervous, because that's the kind of anti-Semitism. That's how anti-Semitism was articulated in the Soviet Union. And I have a lot of materials here. I can show one, I think, typical example of that comes from Soviet publications. So many of these people, when they would go to work or to school in the morning in the Soviet Union, that's the images they saw, on the newspaper stands. And so, yeah, it's a very complicated, very sensitive issue, that we should be aware of. They do recognize that kind of anti-Zionist rhetoric as anti-Semitism. They do not usually recognize the sort of old-fashioned right-wing anti-Semitism and racism, and that's a problem.
Any other questions for one another, dear panelists?
Yes.
Well, I don't want to ask all the questions, so I'm trying to be careful here.
We'll go for it.
But again, I haven't had a chance to get to any of those locations, and I am tasked with trying to teach a class on a relationship between the experience. Here, IU wants me to focus primarily on the experience of African Americans in all these various locations, and I think that may be too narrow. But I'm imploring you to share with me any experiences or documents or archives you could point me to that will make I can actually have a reason to come visit and speak to you in person. So do research on this particular subject, or what is the experience of people of African descent, particularly African Americans who are maybe moved or maybe expatriated or have some connections and linkages there, that I can use and employ in my research and teachings in some way, shape, or form.
And Jacoby, I look forward to taking you around St. Petersburg.
Yeah, me too. I look forward to drinking a lot of vodka. But now I'm listening to you all, and I need to get out of St. Petersburg and Moscow. I'm realizing my perceptions are too narrow there as well. Like, I need to go visit. I've jotted down almost a dozen different places you all named and villages, and there may be experiences and interviews and documents and papers and things that I need to explore there as well. Or just be aware of, just be familiar with. I don't have to visit them all, but at least have some connection to know that they exist and they're important. And even the artistic expressions I hadn't even considered, as I have this art behind me, right? And the ways in which that plays into this conversation as well. So there's a lot of avenues to touch. So I'm hoping to pick some brains and then get, hopefully COVID alleviates so we can actually do some one-on-one, face-to-face, and or some group work as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, please come to Central Asia. It's a fantastic place to explore. And I think one of the venues to look, especially into archives, again, I have to flag everything. I'm not a historian, I'm not an art historian and so on, but definitely looking at the Tashkent Conference of Asian and African and Latin American writers that basically was done after Badung, and I do cover it in my first book in a way how sort of certain Kazakh writers went there and they engaged in this movement. And it was actually a decolonial movement in the Soviet way, Ala Sovietik, they put it like that. And how they then got so inspired and by these conversations. And Dubois was really popular in Central Asia, Soviet Central Asia at the time. And actually one of the novels I'm exploring in one of the chapters of my book is about Kenya. And it's a Kazakh not artist, but writer who writes a whole novel about Kenyan decolonial movement and how he's so excited about, what's going on in Africa. So I think there are quite a lot of engagements, even if on cultural sort of intelligentsia level, if you want to put it like that. And I know there is interest in that because some students have been writing to me on that exploration between African and Central Asian or Latin American and Central Asian perspective. And there are a couple of very exciting PhD dissertations coming up. I think I got an email from Berkeley that somebody's writing there. And definitely, I think I would also suggest the book by Rosen Dgalov, and he wrote on a little bit on that. I also listened to the book panel and it was quite interesting. But definitely the Tashkent conference would be something to look into. And these cultural connections and understandings, and maybe that's where the Soviet understanding or connection to race comes into this, is sort of like, the decolonial peoples of Africa, Latin America, and South Asia as well.
Thank you, wonderful. And thank you all. I'm going to take this opportunity to say what a pleasure it is to listen to speakers with such a breadth of knowledge and such beautiful expression. Thank you so much. And on behalf of our audience, I'm seeing lots of thank yous in the chat, even from people who didn't ask questions, and hope that we will have many chances to encounter each other and each other's research at conferences or on webinars or possibly even drinking vodka.